Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Romans Education Part 7. And this session is going to encompass the notes for sessions 67 and 68. And we really do have quite a bit of notes to cover, so I'm going to glance at my notes a little more than usual so I can stay on track. There's a lot of places here where we could get off track. Now, I put a map on the board just to let you know, and we're going to be filling some things in over the next couple of lessons on this map. If you don't want to copy it down, that's fine. I can see if I can't make a copy and send it to you filled out or bring it the next time. But I think this is going to be pretty instructive for seeing some things here. I want to make one comment right off the bat, and that is the video and the notes are meant to go together. And I'm just saying that because it's easy for folks who are not in the study to either gravitate to one or the other. And I'm going to tell you that I think sometimes the notes, because I've taken the time to go through those, explain things a little more clearly, especially if I feel like I'm being pressured for time. And so the notes are important if you're watching the video. But the video is also important because many times I'm going to say things that are not necessarily in your notes. So I just wanted to say that both of those are meant to go together. Now, when we left off the last time, we were looking at a warning about what the adversary was going to do to oppose our sonship education, and we were looking at some preliminary remarks that were made back in the early part of Proverbs. If you'll just remember, back there when we first looked at this, and I know that this is to the believing remnant of Israel, but what I wanted us to remember is that back there in Proverbs chapter 1, the son was warned about two particular oppositions that were going to come against him, and he was warned about himself being a foolish son and not valuing the education as a son. And he was also warned about the world at large that was going to oppose his education and the things that it was going to be accomplishing in him, and especially how he would spend his time in order to get that education. And so in these preliminary remarks, before the believing remnant gets instructed, and the reason I'm going back and looking at that is because you remember I pointed out to you long ago how the format for Israel's education matches the same format that Paul uses for us. And I want to take that parallel issue and show you something. And so and then when we got down over into Proverbs chapter 2, after some other things are said to the son that were necessary before he begins being educated as a son, Proverbs comes along and gives another opposition after he's given these first two oppositions early in chapter 1, and he finishes out the chapter, and then he starts in Proverbs 2. Then he comes along and he warns us about another opposition, and this one is from the adversary himself, and it's going to come in two forms. It comes in the form of the evil man and then the strange woman. And they're given in that order because that's the order that they're going to be encountered, by the way. And so in the same way, we got some preliminary introductory remarks as we were in our sonship establishment. And that was given to you back over in Romans chapter 8. And then at the end of that chapter, remember, there was also some remarks that were made. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution, and we got those 7 categories of opposition from the adversary himself. So in the same way that a son was educated about opposition in Israel's program, we get educated in the same way in our program. But just as later on in Proverbs 4, if you come on down with that, in Proverbs chapter 4, you're going to get some details about the attack from the adversary. And now that we get into Romans chapter 13, we're going to get some additional details about this. And what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to make sure that we are able to answer this question. There's one thing that's very important, and that is to be able to understand the material enough that when someone says to you, how do you know this or that, that we're actually able to give an answer other than, well, Mike said so at the Bible study. Because that doesn't mean anything. We need to be able to understand this from the Scripture. That's what has to do the work in us. I've told you the story before about a guy that used to come and do a prophecy conference for us back when I was in Louisiana. And he made a statement, and he said, he based a lot of what he was preaching off of it, but he was reading from Matthew chapter 24, and he talked about the fig tree putting forth leaves. And he said, the fig tree putting forth leaves is Israel becoming a nation in May of 1948. That got fulfilled. And he said, and it says that when you see the fig tree put forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. And of course, it was talking about the coming of the Lord. And he attributed that coming of the Lord in Matthew 24 to the rapture. And so he said, so the generation, remember, verily this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. So the generation that saw Israel become a nation would be the generation that would see the rapture take place. And so back there in those days, oh man, I just ate that up. And I mean, I thought this is great. So we took him to supper every night after the deal, and I was so pumped about this thing. But there's still that little deal in me that said, how do we know? How do we know? So when we're sitting at the table, I said to him, hey, I got a question for you. Now, and I'm not asking him because I doubt it. I'm asking him to just explain it. And I said, how do we know that the fig tree putting forth leaves is Israel becoming a nation? I thought that was a fair question. And he jumped all over me. It was almost as though, how dare I ask that question? Well, brother, everybody knows. I can't even believe you. And it just went on like that. I mean, I just shrunk as so we dropped him off at the hotel, and I remember I was the co-pastor at the church. The preacher looked over at me and he said, I got to be honest with you. I was wondering the exact same thing, but I'm glad you asked him and not me. Because, man, he chewed me up and spit me out. And there was and I have a note here. You know how you revisit something and you get all tangled up here? And I had a note here that said, maybe I want to turn to everybody to Matthew 24 and Luke 21. And let's look at this issue. We don't have time to do that. But here's the thing. That when there's a reason he couldn't explain it to me, by the way. Because that's not what that is. Because you know what? That's what we all had kind of been hearing, and it was very exciting, and we thought that was it, you know. And so I don't want to do that to you. I don't want you to say, how do we know that when we get to a certain place in the education, in other words, when we get that initial instruction in godly wisdom and in justice, and then you get down here into judgment, how do we know that it's when we get right into the middle of this first instruction that's when we qualify to get that first attack from the adversary? How do we know that? I want you to be able to answer that question without me going, well, brother, I can't even believe you. Everybody knows, but I don't want to do that. So I'm going to try to lay this out so that God help you if you ever mention this. And someone says, how do you know? You'll be able to give an answer. Oh, okay, now, having said that, I'm going to turn this over here in just a moment to Proverbs chapter 4. And what I want to do is I want to drive home the reality that this not only happens at this point for the believing remnant of Israel in their education, it is happening at the exact same place for us, members of the church, the body of Christ, and the dispensation of grace, at the exact same point in our education. And to show this to you, I'll tell you exactly how we're going to do it. I'm going to take you to an event in Israel's time past history, and I'm going to show you when they began to function in a very particular way. in accordance with what God had instructed them to do. And when that happened, Satan was given the green light to actually come directly against them because of this action. There was, I'm going to say it this way, an overt act that Israel was supposed to perform in order to get that done. Then after we look at that, I'm going to take you into Israel's prophetic future and show you up in the Hebrew epistles the same kind of issue again that the believing remnant is going to be facing out in Daniel's 70th week. And then we'll bring that back to Paul's epistles, and knowing what we know from those things, we're going to bring it right back into our doctrine and see that same thing repeated again. Because once you begin to notice the pattern, then everything really starts to fall into place, and it'll be easy. So I know I could just say it to you, but we're at the point in our education where we can't afford to go home and just say, how do I really know this is right? How do we know this? So I want us to get that down and understand it. Okay, so here's a couple of things that we know right off the bat. We know that the format for Israel's education follows the same format as our education. But there's a second thing also that we know, and that is in the education, we get a form of doctrine that is given to us, and prior to that doctrine, you may get a pre-doctrinal exhortation, and following that doctrine, you may get a post-doctrinal exhortation. And those things are not just meant to guide you in applying the doctrine, but they also serve other purposes. And let me give you an idea. The pre-doctrinal exhortation also works as a checkpoint to make sure that what you just came out of, you've got it down. It's kind of the way to assess your understanding of the doctrine that's been given to you. And then this post-doctrinal exhortation, by the way, is going to come along, and it's going to make sure that you are responding positively and properly to the doctrine. You remember the difference between those. The positive response to the doctrine is, I understand it, and I believe it. I believe it's true. I understand what it's saying, and I believe it. The proper response to the doctrine is, now I've incorporated it into my life. I'm living out of that doctrine now. In other words, it's not just an idea anymore, but now it's impacting my conduct and behavior. So see, without either one of these, that's an incomplete response. Everybody's with me. Now, we've covered that before, so I don't want to dwell on that. But when we get over here in just a moment to Proverbs chapter 4, the son is going to be exhorted to make sure that as he's in judgment, that these things that he's already been through is up and running in him. The same thing is going to be true for us, to make sure that when we get to this point in the education, that the things that have been given to us previously are actually working in us. So we haven't just heard them one time and forgotten about them and kind of shoved them to the back and dismissed them. And to show you, and just to show you this, take a look with me, Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 10. Hear, O my son, and receive my sayings, and the years of thy life shall be many. Now that's an Israel thing, that and the years of thy life shall be many. You don't have any such promise about that in the dispensation of grace. But look, I want to show you that. Now that's in verse 10. Up to this point, take a look at the way that Proverbs has been talking to them. Let's just go through it. Verse 1, hear the instruction of a father. The next one is verse 1, attend to know understanding. The next one is in verse 2, I give you good doctrine. The next one's in verse 4, let thine heart retain my words. And then in verse 5, get wisdom. Now, we're not unfamiliar with these: instruction, understanding, doctrine, wisdom. We got all of that. But did you notice what we read in verse 10 just a moment ago? Back me up, Trent, please, to verse 10, because I didn't think to put it in again in the PowerPoint. Hear, O my son, and receive my sayings. Because when you get into this area of your education, up till now, it's been instruction and doctrine and my words and that kind of business. Now, all of a sudden, when you get here, for them, and it's going to be that way for us, all of a sudden, you get instructed in a different way. You get instructed by sayings. And that's what's going on when you hear that. Now, what is a saying? And I have the Oxford English Dictionary. It's a saying is something that is said by a distinguished person, and apothegm, a dictum. So I looked up that word apothegm, and here's what it is: a terse, pointed saying embodying an important truth in a few words, a pithy or sententious maxim. In other words, well, okay, that didn't do you any good either, did it? But you understand, it's taking a very important truth and it's condensing it down into a very short saying. Has that been happening with us? Indeed it has, and I think the next thing ought to show it to us. No, I didn't have it up there. But for us, for instance, when we got into godly judgment, do you remember the first part of this? It says, for now it is high time to awake out of sleep. You remember that? That's a saying. That encapsulated something. When we got into verse 12, do you remember how that one started? The night is far spent, the day is at hand. How long did we spend going back and looking at everything that was packed into the night is far spent, not completely spent, the day is at hand, talking about the timing of the dispensation of grace? In other words, you know what Paul is doing? He's doing exactly what the proverb said was going to be done to the believing remnant. He's using sayings. They embody in a short, terse phrase an important truth that has a whole lot packed into it. Now, see if you can, give me this next step, Proverbs 4. Now look, you should be able, if I'm right, you should be able to find all three of these in this passage. They're not always going to be known by that name, but they could be. For instance, can anybody look in that and find wisdom? Now this is actually the easiest one. Verse 11. I have taught thee in the way of wisdom. By the way, when he says, I have taught thee in the way of the wisdom, that looks like it's past tense, doesn't it? I've already done that. Now I want you to look at where he's gone here. Now, by the way, when you look at this passage, can anybody find justice? It's not going to say it that way. No, before 12, in 11, I have led thee in right paths. Remember remember what justice is? It's God's norms and standards of what's right and what's wrong. Remember? I've led thee in right paths. There. So in your Bible, you might just put a little parenthesis out there and write justice beside that, because look, in verse 11, I have taught thee in the way of wisdom. You've done that. I have led thee in right paths. That looks like that's past tense too, doesn't it? Yeah. So see, that's behind you. So what would the next thing be? The next thing would be judgment, but it's not going to be called judgment. It's going to be called something else. Now, do you see that anywhere? Take a look down in verse 13. Take fast hold of instruction. There's the judgment right there. And that's not past tense. Do you know why? At this point, the son is told to take fast hold of it. You know what that is? That's like it's a present tense thing. Do you see? So he says, look, you've already been through this. You've already been through this. And now that you're in this, I need you to get this. You see how the tense kind of changed there? Okay. And so that terminology, now there's a reason, and I'm kind of made myself a note about it, But look, I don't want to take the time here. I'm already looking at this thing. I don't want to take the time here to talk about why he's using the word instruction. But look, that really is what he's talking about when it comes to judgment. Now, let me take you down to verse 14 in this chapter. Enter not into the path of the wicked. Go not into the way of evil men. You know what's different about that? When you were first warned about the evil man, back here in Proverbs chapter 2, it was a singular, evil man. And if you recall, in the last session, I told you that this is going to change from the singular to the plural, because this singular is like the overarching description of the whole policy of evil for that. But here's what Satan is going to use to do that. Not just one guy that's going to go everywhere, but it's evil men. And that's the way the attack is going to come. Listen to me. We have to pay attention to this because that's the way the attack is going to happen here. And this is going to come in the first wave of attacks. We're going to have to identify these people. And there is a way to do it, and it's found in the Scripture. Look what he says in 50. Avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it, and pass away. For they sleep not, except they have done mischief, and their sleep is taken away unless they cause some to fall. Now, I need to keep reading. Give me this next one, Trent. I'm sorry, I thought that was in. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence, but the path of the just is as the shining light that shineth more and more unto the perfect day. The way of the wicked is as darkness. They know not at what they stumble. Think about what we've been talking about in Romans chapter 13. And since we're at the same spot in Proverbs that we're talking about in Romans, do you see any terminology that reminds you of what we've been looking at here? Sure, look at all of that. You've got, first of all, you've got the wicked that we saw in the previous slide, but here, the path of the just is as the shining light, and it shines more and more unto the perfect day. The way of the wicked is as darkness. See, this is the very issue we've been talking about. So we're called to cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. See, this terminology being the same is not just a coincidence. But in fact, if you know that Proverbs has already set it out this way, you could kind of overlay Romans right on top of that and see some of the same terminology being used. Now, I'm going to give you a little comparison here, and I sure hope this PowerPoint works right. No, give me this next one. There you go. Proverbs 2 was the evil man. Proverbs 4 is evil men. Then Proverbs 2 is they walk in the ways of darkness. Proverbs 4 says, the way of the wicked is as darkness. Do you see how these are? See, you got warned about it up in 2, but when you get to 4, you're going to get some more things layered on here. I'm trying to show you it's the same thing. Proverbs 2, they leave the paths of uprightness. Proverbs 4, back me up. Proverbs 4, when he's talking to the son, he says, enter not into the path of the wicked. And why? Because that's going to be the attack of the evil men, is to get you off of the path that's right and get this whole group moving on a different path. Here's the next one. Proverbs 2, they rejoice to do evil. In Proverbs 4, they eat the bread of wickedness. And then Proverbs 2, their ways are crooked. But look what the son is exhorted in Proverbs 4. Enter not into the path. Their ways are crooked. Enter not into their path. Go not into the way. Avoid it. I'm just pulling it right out of the Scripture. Pass not by it. Turn from it. Pass away. See, the son is saying, don't have anything to do with that. Because it's real easy to look and say, well, don't you think we need to help these men? Look, these guys have one goal, and you're going to have to steer away from the path that they're going to try to take this group, and the group in Monaghan's too, take them right down. Now, one of the first tactics, I want to talk to you about one of the first tactics that Satan is going to employ in his attack to get us to back off of our sonship. He's going to use these evil men as part of his policy of evil, and their goal is to get us to walk in the ways of darkness. Now remember what the darkness is? It's Satan's untruth that's meant to replace the light of God's truth. So their goal is to get us to do that by putting our light out and having us walk with them. And I know I'm giving this to you in a very general way right now, but that's the way that this information has been given to us right now. And so the believing remnant is here instructed to enter not into the path of the wicked. And by the way, and that's going to be, if their path is going to be a shining light, guess what yours is supposed to be? The same thing, because you're supposed to put on the armor of light. Now, take a look in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 18. But the path of the just as the shining light that shineth more and more unto the perfect day. That phrase right there gets picked up in the books from Hebrews to Revelation, gets picked up over in the Hebrew epistles, and there is an issue there where their light is supposed to shine more and more and be brighter and brighter, and Paul's going to talk about the same issue with us as we put on the armor of light, and that light stands in greater and greater contrast to the darkness of Satan's works of darkness. Now, I want to prepare us now to take a look at this example in Israel's time past program. I told you that we were going to come to look at a place in the Bible where Satan's attack was going to come against the nation of Israel as they did something to cast off the works of darkness that Satan is promoting in the world. And what I want us to see is not only that Satan's attack came against them when they did that, but it was by their light that he knew that he now had the opportunity to bring his attack against them. When that light comes on, that's the signal that Satan can now do what he wants to do to stop what we're doing to thwart his plan in the world. So this is going to be found in Deuteronomy 4. Let me give you just a little context here for Deuteronomy 4. Israel had been wandering in the wilderness, you know that, and they're going to have a second opportunity to go into the promised land. Now this is where our map is going to kind of come into play here, so I'm going to pull this off so I'll have some room to put some things up here. They're going to get this second, and that's what Deuteronomy means. It's a second giving of the law. But look, God is not just giving them the law a second time for no reason, or just to repeat himself. In fact, he does repeat the law, but then he's going to come back and he's going to add something about what Israel is supposed to do in the land. And he's going to go over some particular operations that the nation is supposed to perform once they get themselves into the land and get themselves established in the land. There is something they are supposed to do. And we're going to see that this impact, but once they get in here and they do this, this is going to impact the Gentile nations around the world, and especially those nations around the nation of Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 5. No, back me up. Here you go. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do so in the land whither you go to possess it. Now look, I've taught you statutes and judgments that you should do so in the land. In other words, this was important to be done at a specific place, not while they're wandering to the land. They're told to do this in the land. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding. Notice this first part, in the sight, that's the first part, in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what nation is there so great, who hath God so nigh unto them, as the Lord our God is in all things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great, that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day? Now, excuse me, we're going to come back and kind of break that down, but let me just say it like this. There's two concepts that are sitting in that, and Jesus called them by these names in the Gospels when he said, you are the light of the world, and you're the salt of the earth. Now, we spent time on this sometime a few sessions back, so I don't need to go back and review that, but both of those concepts are found right there. And so God is going to bring these issues up to Israel, and Deuteronomy 4 isn't the only time he's going to bring these up. But they're going to be brought up over and over again, and God is going to give them the mechanical means, if I can say it that way, of how to be light and salt. In other words, this is not just an idea. This is not me saying to Tom, go out there and be light. That's very vague. And God is not vague. There is and I'm going to say it again, an overt act that by the doing of it, they will become the light of the world. Now look, when a room is very, very dark, even a single match throws off a lot of light and becomes very visible. In fact, the greater the darkness, the more visible the light, right? All right, so here's the point I'm going to make. What Israel is going to do with their statutes and judgments, and let me just pause and say something here about that. If you ever go over to Psalm 119, you'll see all kinds of terminology over there. I should have erased this whole thing. You'll see that he talks about statutes, he talks about judgments, he talks about testimonies, he talks about ordinances, he talks about, you ever seen all, you know what I'm talking about. He's done all precepts, you know, and if you look through Psalm 119, you'll see all those things mentioned. Those are not just synonyms for the law. Those are component parts of the law. And the statutes and judgments were the parts that not only were important for Israel to obey, but when they did, there was something they were going to do with them that would make Israel begin to operate as the light of the world and the salt of the earth. In other words, when they did that overt act, those statutes and judgments made it so that their God stood out in stark contrast to the gods of the Gentiles. By the way, the only God the Gentiles didn't know about is the one true God. That's the only one. They knew all of them, but him. So God says, I'm going to show, because I want those Gentile nations to look at what your God does, and I want them to look at what their God does and go, hey, wait a minute. Our God doesn't do anything like that. That's the light concept. In other words, enable them to see something. And then the salt concept is that, look, when you put salt on something, it preserves it, but what else does it do? It seasons it. And when you if you ever eat something that's bland, but if you salt that right, you know what it does? It creates an appetite. And that's what the salt concept is doing. It's creating an appetite to know this God. It's increasing their desire. That's why he says, if the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? In other words, you guys, you know what? Not only do you need to stand out in contrast, by the way, that's why the distinctiveness of Israel was so important. To not be like the other nations of the world. If you're going to be like them, they're going to look at you and go, why do we need you? You're like us. So the light concept, and now the light was to say, hey, there's a big difference here. And the salt concept was to create an appetite, an increased hunger to know about the things of the true God. Now I'm going to say it again. There was an overt act that Israel was supposed to perform that allowed them to begin functioning this way. And by the way, these two are always given in this order because until Israel functions as light, they cannot function as salt. Now we'll take a look at that and see that in a little more detail later on. But this is what God means for them to do to impact the other nations of the world. Now, let's see. I was doing the Deuteronomy 4, and I kind of left my notes, and let me see where I am. Okay, so let's take you to Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 5. Now remember, what is Satan's desire? Not just to produce darkness, but to maintain that darkness in the world. And if Israel is going to become a light and expose his works of darkness for what they are, then he needs to put out that light. Remember that thing we read in Proverbs? I started to call your attention to it. I just didn't do it. But remember, he says, they walk in darkness. They stumble at what they see not. That's what Satan is counting on. Look, if you've ever gotten up in the middle of the night and you're in a dark part of the house and something is sitting in the way, you ever hit your toe right on it? Man, I have. Talk about light you up. And that, if I'd have just seen it, Satan is counting on the fact that the world will not see those works of darkness for what they really are. And any light disrupts his ability to keep men stumbling in the darkness. And that's going to be true with Israel, and it's going to be true with us as well. So now, Deuteronomy 4:5. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do so in the land, whether you go to possess it. Now, I talked about that having to happen in the land. These are the two component parts that are supposed to make an impact on the Gentiles, especially those parts of the law. Now look in verse 6. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear. By the way, that ought to be ringing a bell with you, because I told you that casting off the works of darkness was a visible, audible display of disassociating ourselves from those works of darkness, and putting on the armor of light was the same thing. Something that can not only be seen in our conduct, but could be heard coming from us. I'm trying to establish the similarity of the issue here, of that which is seen and that which is heard. And so I know we read that verse just a moment ago, so I don't want to read all of that again. But look, if the primary sphere of Israel is for the nations around them, you understand that what we say and what we do I'm almost well, has a primary influence on principalities and powers. That's what this is for. Will men be affected by it? Of course. Of course. But look, here's the thing. You say, well, why do we need to do that for principalities and powers? Because Satan can't mind read, and he doesn't know where you are in the education. There is a point that will be demonstrated by us when we function with that armor of light, and only when Satan sees that does he know that he has the green light. Thank you, Brother Tommy. Oh, that's lemonade. Oh, that's great. Thank you. I keep kicking that over. That's when he gets the green light to bring his attack, because he doesn't know where we are until he sees it. If you're in the dark and a light comes on, that's when he knows. And that's just as there was an overt act that Israel would do that would cause them to begin to function as the light of the world, which they had to do first, there is an overt act that we also will do that will signal to him that we also are functioning in accordance with that light. Now let me show you the way in which Israel was going to do this in their time past program. Look in verse 18. I'm setting you up for what I think is something very phenomenal here. Therefore shall you lay up these my words in your heart and in your soul. That's where they were meant to do their work. and bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. And ye shall teach them your children, speaking of them when thou sittest in thine house, when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. Now let's just stop there for a moment. What is he saying when he says that? You're going to teach these. By the way, I didn't want to take much time to do this. Back me up, Trent. When he first starts this off, he talks to the adults about this is how you're going to do this for yourself. For yourself. Lay up these words in your heart and in your soul. Bind them for a sign upon your hand. They be as frontlets between your eyes. When he does that, now he's going to come along and say, and now here's how you're going to deal, not with yourselves, but with your children. So now we get to the next verse. And you shall teach them your children, speaking of them when thou sittest in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. What is he saying? Talk about them when? All the time. Use every opportunity you have to talk to your children about these statutes and judgments. Verse 20. And thou shalt write them upon the doorpost of thine house and upon thy gates. What's the doorpost of the house? That's where you cut. That's right. When you cut, if you leave out the door, guess what? You're looking at them. When you come in the door, guess what? You're looking at them. The gate, when you leave your property, you're looking at them. When you come into your property, you're looking at them. In other words, you know what? Everything we do, I'm going to be reminding you of these things. Everywhere you go, you're going to... Everything we do together, you're going to be hearing them, and everywhere you go, you're going to be seeing them. Do you see this concept? I'm just trying to drive this home. That your days may be multiplied and the days of your children in the land which the Lord sware to your fathers to give them as the days of heaven upon the earth. Now, I'm going to skip those verses that because I kind of condensed that all together. Trent, take me to verse 22. This is the means by which the nation is going to function as the light of the world. For if you shall diligently keep all these commandments which I command you to do them, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and cleave unto him, then will the Lord drive out all these nations from before you, and you shall possess greater nations and mightier than yourselves. When they got ready to go into the land, here's what Israel knew. They knew that all of the Gentile nations really came in two categories, and they were supposed to deal with them differently. The first category was nations in the land. And what were they supposed to do with the nations that were in the land? Absolutely destroy them. Were they supposed to make a peace treaty with them? Let me ask you this. Were they supposed to be light and salt to them? No. No. And there's a reason. They were supposed to utterly destroy them. By the way, those nations just didn't happen to be in the land. Those were Satan's nations in that land. You want to talk about a nation of evil men. But then you got the second category, and that's all the nations, O-U-T, out of the land. And guess what? If you're a nation out of the land, Israel is supposed to be light to you. If you're a nation in the land, they're going to wipe you out. That's why, remember those guys from Gibeon? They were in the land. What'd they do? They dressed up. They put dirt all over them, put old clothes. They did it to their animals. They came in. They said, oh, we came from a long ways off. We want to make a peace treaty with you. And Israel's thinking, Joshua said, well, of course, you know what? We're supposed to be light and salt to these guys. We'll make a treaty with you. And then they find out they're right here. They're right here. No, they didn't. Excuse me. When they cross over, here's Jericho. Here's Gibeon. When they crossed over right here, man, but see, they fooled them. Okay, my only point is to say that's why they did it. They thought they were in the second category of nations. They knew about this before they ever came into the land. They were instructed about that. And now, where are we? Now, verse 24. Every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours. From the wilderness in Lebanon, from the river Euphrates. And by the way, that river ran up here. It's off the board. I actually ran out of room, put Damascus up there, but it's way up north of Damascus. The river Euphrates, even unto the uttermost sea, which is the Mediterranean, shall your coast be. There shall no man be able to stand before you, for the Lord your God shall lay the fear of you and the dread of you upon all the land. By the way, that's a secondary reason. When everybody in this land gets destroyed, you know what everybody else is looking at? Oh my. And you know what? Jericho had big walls. And they came in there and blew trumpets and broke lanterns, and oh my goodness, the walls fell down. God says, I'm laying the fear and the dread of you upon all these nations. We're going to get their attention. Lay the fear of you and the dread of you upon all the land that you shall tread upon, as he hath said unto you. Boy, I got to go. So that's that category, that the nations that are in the land to be destroyed. Now I want to talk about the overt act. What is the overt act? Deuteronomy 11:26. Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. A blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, and a curse if you'll not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside out of the way which I command you this day, to go after other gods which you have known not. Now, we know about that. They were under a performance system, right? But now look at this. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord thy God hath brought thee in unto the land whither thou goest to possess it, that thou shalt put the blessing upon Mount Gerizim and the curse upon Mount Ebal. Are they not on the other side Jordan, by the way where the sun goeth down, in the land of the Canaanites, which dwell in the champaign over against Gilgal, beside the plains of Morah? Now you have to ask yourself, why in the world does he go to so much detail? I mean, just look at that thing. That's almost kind of like GPS coordinates. I mean, here's the first thing. He's telling them where to do this, and they don't know where they've got to be given some landmarks to know where this is. But there's a second thing here, and this is really great. Let's see, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Where am I? I'm in verse 29 and 30. Is that? Oh, I got more to read, sorry. For ye shall pass over Jordan to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God giveth you, and you shall possess it, and dwell therein, and you shall observe to do all the statutes and judgments which I set before you this day. Now, in order for them to function as the light of the world, once they get into the land, they're going to have to do something here. And what they're going to have to do, because right in this area right here, this is the plains of Morah. And there's two mountains. There's a mountain right here, and there's a mountain right here, and there's a valley that runs between them. We stood there in 2004. This is Mount Ebal, and this is Mount Gerizim. And he said, I want you to put the blessing on Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Now, I can remember years ago reading that, and I thought, put the blessing on Mount Gerizim. Was he supposed to just recite the blessing there? But wait, this whole thing has been about something in the sight of the nations, which they will hear. And I kept thinking, what does that mean to put the blessing on these mountains? And by the way, now this is, I'm going to just... Oh, I just don't want to give this away too soon, but I just really want to do it. I got, 6 minutes left here. Look at that. Let me take you to verse 30. Give me this next verse. No, do I have one just 30? There you go. Are they not, these two mountains, are they not, by the way, this area right here, I should have just told you, this is a real flat area called the Champaign. That's right there. So now when we read this, are they not on the other side Jordan, Okay? By the way where the sun goeth down. You have to think about what you're saying. By the way. He didn't say where the sun, just go to where the sun goes down. You'd just go all the way around the world, wouldn't you? So but he says, by the way where the sun goeth down. By the way. The way, folks, is a road. In fact, you may have it marked in the back of your Bible on some of your maps. There is a road that ran like this, that came up and went this way, and it went up this way, and this branched off and went up to Damascus. And here's what happened. When anybody up north wanted to go down south, or the folks south up north, this was the major trade route through the land. And this thing went right in this valley between these mountains. And here's what was going to happen. He said, you're going to put the curse on Ebal and the blessing on Gerizim. Now, I'm going to tell you what that means, because this is just wonderful. This is what I've been waiting to get to. But the thing is, when they do that, they've got, if you're going from here to here or from here to here, and there's no branch off until you get through those mountains. And then you can either go on up north to Assyria, or you could go this way to Damascus, but you can't branch off until every Gentile traveler has passed right between those two mountains. I've just almost given it away. Right there. Because here's what he does. We're in Deuteronomy 11. You remember where we started? We started in Deuteronomy 4. And he said, this is the statutes and judgments that the nations, in their sight and by what they hear, they're going to be impacted by you. And then, by the time he gets back, I'm telling you, when he first gives it to them, he's just reciting the law. But when he comes back in Deuteronomy 11, he comes back and he says, now, I'm going to show you how to begin to function as the light. The first thing you need to function as. And in Deuteronomy 11, he tells them how to do that. You put the blessing and the curse on those two mounts. And then he says, where? Are they not on the other side of Jordan by the way? See, the sun is going this way. So as they cross Jordan, there is a way that they will encounter going toward the way where the sun goes down. See? It says, in the land of the Canaanites, which dwell in the Champaign, which is right there, over against Gilgal. By the way, there's a Gilgal over here. That's not the same one. This one is up here. There's two of them. Against Gilgal, beside the plains of Morah. This is the plains of Morah right up here. That all sits in that area. So there's those two mountains. So he's telling them, this is where you'll find it. And this is why I want you to do it here. Because I need something to be done on these two mountains that's going to impact the Gentiles. Because once Israel gets settled into this land, they're going to open this trade route again. And the Gentiles are meant to come through there. And they're going to come from Egypt and come up this way, or they're going to, come from Damascus over, or come through Hazor from the north. So, good, I have a minute and 21 seconds, and I'm going to use it all. So I'm right at the place that I want to be, because it's on this major trade route that Israel will perform the overt act that allows them to begin to function as the light of the world. And when they do, listen, I'm going to show it to you at the very first of the next lesson. When they do, God says this. It's not going to be an exact quote, but this is pretty close. As soon as they do it, he goes, now you are the people of God. Now, see how I used to read that and you used to think, weren't they always his chosen people? He didn't say, now you're my chosen people. He said, now you are the people of God. You know what that means? They have now, for the first time, begun to function in accordance with His plan and purpose for them in the land. Now, this is going to be fantastic when you see this, because you know what this is? This is a return for detail. He started in Deuteronomy 4. He cycled back around to Deuteronomy 11. He gave you that. And now we're going to go one more time into Deuteronomy, and He's going to give them the last piece. And He's going to just keep layering on a little more information, a little more information. This is an amazing thing. And when you see it, oh, I did use it all. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll take a break. And then we'll come back, and I'm going to show you something I think is really fantastic. Okay. Check my battery.